Hey guys, Josh from the Ancient History Guy here. Hello and welcome to all. I hope you're having a fantastic day. Today we are going to be looking at probably one of the more mysterious of the cultures of the ancient world, and that's the culture of the Celts, specifically its origins and its expansion into regions you wouldn't necessarily originally think of. Now, Celtic culture is pretty much universally acknowledged as having originated in the Alps of Switzerland/Austria. Now, the Alps are a fairly important part of human history. You see, during the Ice Ages, they were a natural haven for those migrating away from the cold. You see, the Ice Age wasn't always snow and ice. It did have periods in the year where it was not warm per se, but warmer than normal. During these time periods, people and animals would graze and hunt on vast grasslands. However, as the year progressed, it would naturally get colder, so animals, including humans, would migrate from these grasslands towards the mountain ranges, which blocked off most of the weather systems whilst also providing a decent amount of shelter. It seems only sensible then that the Alps would be one of the places early humans chose to settle. The Alps had several lakes as well as rivers, giving the early humans the access to water they needed to grow crops. A distinct culture began to be formed in the relative safety of the petri dish that was the Alps, and as the population began to explore outwards, two distinct alpine cultures began to emerge, those of the Latin and the Hassalt. Eventually, these two cultures sort of merged into one, resulting in the formation of the Celtic culture. Other places, such as Britain, were so close to the Celts that via trade and migration, the land gradually became more and more Celt-like. Now, the Celtic culture came to dominate most of Western Europe, pushing aside the native cultures of modern-day France and Spain. Now, thanks to our friends the Romans, we often think of the Celts as being quite underdeveloped, not even being capable of producing simple things such as coins. However, this is not the case. It appears the Celts were actually quite a big fan of trading, with many of the huge Celtic cities actually being trading centres between themselves and the more quote-unquote developed cultures of the East, such as the Greeks. In fact, we know for a fact that the Celts were particularly fond of wine from Greece, so much so that the Carthaginians often pretended to be selling Greek wine in order to turn over a profit. Indeed, the Greeks seem to have traded quite regularly with the Celts, with the name Celt actually coming from the Greek name for the people, Celtioi. Indeed, the Celts seem to be particularly fond of personal wealth. Trade was obviously the easiest way to gain said wealth, so a large group of Celtic peoples would leave their homelands in Switzerland/France and migrate outwards. Now, as mentioned before, the Celts were well aware that there were great riches to the east of their homeland, specifically around the big industrialized cities such as those found in Italy and Greece. As such, huge tribes began to move to be closer to these rich centres of trade, with some Celtic tribes following the Danube all the way into what the Greeks called Thracia. This tribe brought many Celtic customs along with them, with their influence, especially in warfare, gradually spreading outwards, and they were adopted by the locals. Indeed, many Celtic settlements in Thrace became centres of trade, noticeably with tribes from across the Danube. This is most noticeable in Illyria, where Celts made up a large portion of the population. What is interesting though is that the majority of these people seem to have arrived in these areas peacefully, as unlike what we will be discussing next, there is no evidence of large-scale invasions or looting. Instead, these Celtic cultural centres seem to have spontaneously came into existence, either as a result of trade or exposure to the culture. This is in stark contrast to what was going on in Italy and Greece. Now, these events are going to be a bit confusing as each leaders of each of these Celtic tribes I'm talking about are both known by the same name, Brennus. So to make things easier to understand, I'm going to be referring to the Brennus in Italy as Brennus I, whilst the Brennus in Greece I'm going to be referring to as Brennus II. Okay, so the first Brennus was a tribal leader of a large group of Celts migrating downwards from France, which the Romans called Gaul. Now, these Celts were leaving their homeland as they had essentially been budged aside by another neighbouring tribe, and figured their best bet was to simply go elsewhere. So we are dealing with an actual tribal migration here, not just a war party. Arriving in Italy, these Celts began besieging Italian towns, which of course spurred the city of Rome into action. The Celts defeated the Romans and came very close to taking the Romans' capital. Fortunately, the assault on the last Roman holdout in the city failed, with the Romans essentially paying Brennus I to leave them alone. As mentioned before, the Celts did like gold and wealth, and so this bribe worked wonders. Now, at this point it's often assumed that Brennus just went on his way, whilst the Romans rebuilt their army. Truth be told, an exiled Roman had enough time to reassemble the Roman army and arrived just after the bribe had been paid. The Romans drove the Celts out of the city and then defeated the now weakened Celts just a few miles outside of the city's boundaries. Nevertheless, the Celts would remain in Italy for centuries, with many tribes providing troops to the invading Carthaginian general Hannibal in his war with Rome. Now, Brennus too led a similar, but one could argue more successful raid into Greece. Following already established trade routes, this Brennus led a huge Celtic invasion/migration/raid into one of the richest lands of the ancient world. All attempts at stopping this invasion were unsuccessful, with the Celts bursting through the Thermopylae Pass and into Delphi, where they looted the sacred site. Eventually, the Greeks managed to defeat the Celtic forces, which rather than retreat back the way they had come, decided to simply hop over the Hellespont and set up shop in central Anatolia. These Celts became known as the Galatians, prospering in between the Greek empires of the Seleucids and the Attalids, hiring themselves out as mercenaries and bodyguards. Indeed, many Galatians would find regular employment in Egypt, serving as royal bodyguards. This was the last big migration of Celts. There were many other migrations just on a smaller scale, and ultimately within already established Celtic lands, thus bringing the Celtic expansion to an end. So what do I think of this? Personally, I find it fascinating that the Celts expanded just so far out of Europe. More often than not, we tend to think of Celtic culture as being a distinct Western European thing. This is probably because the last remnants of Celtic culture can be found in the Britannic Isles and a small bit of France. Truth is, Celtic culture was far more expansive, and it wasn't as undeveloped as many sources would like us to believe. For instance, a majority of the Celtic settlements east of Switzerland seem to have been trading colonies, set up so that smaller Celtic tribes could make a decent living for themselves. Although large-scale migrations/invasions were not uncommon, it's clear from the evidence that this was not the norm, with only a few large invasions in recorded history. But those are just my thoughts. What do you think? Let me know down in the comments below. Thank you for watching and listening to our videos. Be sure to like, comment and subscribe if you've enjoyed. All sources are listed and linked in the description below. I've been the Ancient History Guy, and as always, I'll be seeing you later.